Hi everybody, this is lecture 3. And lecture 3 is a little different than the other lectures we've done so far in that it's not about content as in reading what anthropologists have to say about things. In this lecture I actually want to talk about methods in cultural anthropology, and particularly one method, which is interviewing, in order to give you some background and some ideas for an assignment you will be doing that's a little bit later in October, right, about a month from now, where you're going to be doing some interviews yourself. So I want to prep you for that and give you some, background on really how cultural anthropologists do their work and what kinds of methods they employ. So that's our goal for this lecture. So the title is Methods in Cultural Anthropology Interviewing, and that is what I'm going to focus on, the interviewing, but I wanted to start with just a little bit more of an overview, not a complete overview, but a little context. So we've already talked about the fact that cultural anthropology is a qualitative social science, and that the way that anthropologists do that social science is a practice called fieldwork, where the anthropologist basically embeds themselves in a community that they want to learn from, spends time there, and does ideally a sort of holistic study of what's going on in that cultural world. Not everything, right? Cultural anthropologists specialize, so one would be looking for particular things, but the idea is that those particular things are connected to lots of other things, so spending time in the day-to-day of that community helps you understand both the phenomenon you're interested in specifically and the context of that. So during that period of field work, right, while anthropologists are, living in a community they want to learn from, what I have on the slide here are some of the specific activities that the anthropologist would be engaging in, all right? So taken together, this set of methods is sort of part of the toolbox that an anthropologist would employ in the conduct of field work, okay? This is not an exhaustive list. There are other techniques and activities that cultural anthropologists use. I wanted to make it a relatively short list, and I really wanted to focus on 2 of these methods because they are going to be a part of this course. But I threw a few others in just so you get a bit of an idea of the range of things that anthropologists do. So, when we use that term methods, what we're talking about is the activities, the research activities that a researcher uses to collect information that they will then analyze and make some kind of argument or finding about, right? So for cultural anthropologists, again, while they're in the field doing ethnographic research, interviewing and observation are 2 of the big primary methods that one would use. I put mapping, genealogies, and photography or film on here as well, but let's start with the 2 that I think are sort of indispensable. It's hard to imagine doing research, doing field work as a cultural anthropologist and not engaging in both interviews and observation, all right? So interviewing, which we'll talk about in more detail in a few minutes, and that's the one that you're going to focus on for this interview assignment, is, to put it kind of simply, it's having a conversation with someone wherein you, the interviewer, have an agenda, meaning you have things you want to learn about. So it's not just an open-ended chat. It may feel like an open-ended chat sometimes, but the interviewer goes into that conversation with a set of things they're trying to find out, right? So although it feels like a everyday conversation in some ways, the interviewer is bringing particular issues to the table, right? You may end up digressing and talking about lots of other stuff, but your goal as the interviewer is to try to get your questions answered in some way, because that's what you're trying to learn about, right? Interviews take a lot of different forms, and I'm going to talk about a couple of those variations in a minute, but I think for now, suffice to say, having conversations with lots of different people in a field site, people with different social positions, with, of different genders, of different ages, like the idea of, again, getting sort of a rounded understanding of what's going on in a particular place is one of the things one would try to do, right? part of the thinking here is that what you'll learn from interviewing a whole bunch of different people is both that there are some things that become themes or patterns where lots of different people, or most or all the people in a community, have similar stories and ideas about some things. And you will also find that there are some things or some ways in which those interviews differ, right? I mean, people are still individuals, and people's experiences and their take on things is informed by things like their social positioning, right? So interviewing is really useful. Again, it's sort of bread and thank you, Siri. It's sort of the bread and butter of what anthropologists do, and it's something you all are going to try out for this assignment. Okay, so that's sort of the first main one. Observation, I put it observation/participant observation, is another really central method for cultural anthropologists. This observation and participant observation are two variations on a theme, right? Observing in general is simply attending to the things going on around you with as much care as you can, right? Meaning as much attention to detail as you can, and recording it in some way, right? Like either writing notes, again, tried and true technique of cultural anthropologists everywhere, taking notes. Some folks will use things like photography or film, depending on the kind of study, but it's really about honing your ability to watch things and to try to see as many of the details of what is going on, so that later, right, having done a bunch of that observation, you can start to, again, see both patterns and things that are unique, etc. All right. Now, the difference between observation and participant observation is sort of what the name implies, right? Participant observation has long been like the thing that cultural anthropologists claim as distinctive. Lots of other fields now use participant observation, so it's not unique to anthropology. But the idea with participant observation is not only that you're observing, but that you're participating in the activities that you are observing. So it's the idea of becoming sort of like an apprentice, right? Or a student of the activities taking place around you. And as you do so, you learn a lot of things about those activities, right? So if you are physically, getting up and, carrying something across the room or helping someone cook or whatever it may be, you're learning a lot of things that you don't get if you're sitting in the corner watching. You get a lot of things from sitting in the corner watching too, right? And anthropologists often use both ways, right? Participating in some ways, and then also like staying on the sidelines. You get a different perspective and you can pay attention to different things when you're in the action or sort of outside of the action. But both of those are really important. And part of the reason they're important is because they make a really nice participant observation, that is, they make a really good complement to interviewing, right? When you interview people, you're asking them to report on things that they've experienced, that they think, that they feel, etc., which is great. When you observe people, you're seeing people actually doing some of those things that they talked to you about. And often one will find that those are not exactly the same thing. How people talk about things and how people actually do those things. And I'm not saying people are like hiding things or lying, but simply we have different perspectives even on our own behavior when we sort of say what we think we do than what one can actually observe from the outside, right? So again, it's not to say one is better information than the other, but more that they each have a place, and together they allow you to get a better sense and also see some places maybe of disjuncture or tension, right? Things that you might want to investigate more. So those two are definitely key parts of the toolbox of a cultural anthropologist. So these other things on the slide are also important, but maybe wouldn't necessarily be used by every single cultural anthropologist. Folks would use this if it's relevant to a particular study or whatever, right? So mapping is one I put on here just because I think it helps you to think about how anthropologists are taking on their work. So you might very well find that sort of creating an understanding of how space is organized in a particular community would be really useful for you to understand, say, the relationships between folks, or if there's anything notable about where people put, this kind of building versus that kind of building. You might even do a sort of mapping or almost a blueprint of a particular, something smaller than the entire town. Maybe the shape of a church, for example, is important. Are there two doors that men go in one and women go in the other? Is there an altar at the front, right? Or not, right? All of those kinds of things. You can imagine doing like a top-down drawing, right? Depending on the context you're in or what kind of software you have, right? But by mapping, I mean taking note of and recording how space is organized, so you can again apply that to your understanding of the social world that you're interested in. Genealogies, which are, I think, especially relevant as in this class, because we're going to talk about family and how people sort of understand family and family relationships. So genealogies would be maybe a subset of interviews, right, where you'd be asking people to really talk about a family tree, who's related to whom and in what ways. Part of that is to get a sense of specific relationships, like, these two are siblings and these two are whatever, married, and like that helps to sort of understand the nature of those relationships. But genealogies also help you understand categories of people that are part of the broader social and often political structure, right? So in a lot of societies, the different ways you were related to different lineages, right? Like, for example, the lineage you're born into versus the lineage you marry into. Or, for example, who is considered an eligible potential spouse for you, right? Those kinds of things, and the way that people like pattern those, like what the rules are about that, again, can be really telling about broader questions beyond family. So genealogies, again, are a long-standing technique that cultural anthropologists use. And then finally, I did want to throw in photography and film, just to note that the work that anthropologists do is not all sort of verbal or textual, right? So not all, but some anthropologists make use of photography and film. Indeed, some anthropologists produce ethnographic films. So instead of writing a book, for example, they would produce, a film of some length. Usually they're shorter than like a feature film, but that captures what they want an audience to know about that place through a visual medium instead of through a written medium. Okay, so again, this is not exhaustive, but this is an overview of some of the key methods used by cultural anthropologists. All right, so let's zero in on interviewing then. I'm going to start with something just because I think it's a nice little sort of way to start to think about the ins and outs of interviewing and their place in cultural anthropology. So this is an excerpt from a book written by a well-known early anthropologist named Evans Pritchard. This is from his book called The Nuer, which is about people at the time living in Sudan. And it was published in 1940. So this is, sort of old time stuff. But it's considered sort of, again, one of those early full texts, like a monograph about a certain group of people that has had some influence in the field overall. And part of what Evans Pritchard puts in the text is this little exchange. And the reason I wanted to include it here is because I think it speaks to really, in some ways, how straightforward interviewing is, right? Like, it's a really basic back and forth, asking people often really simple questions, right? What you do in an interview is often not asking them, like, what's the meaning of life? It's asking them something kind of specific from their everyday, right? But at the same time, those simple exchanges can sometimes be very complicated, and I think that's what Evans Pritchard demonstrates in this. So this is the exchange. So in this little exchange, is Evans Pritchard, right, the anthropologist. Kuhl is the name of a man he's having an interview with, or trying to have an interview with. So Evans Pritchard says, "Who are you?" And Kuhl answers, "A man." "What is your name?" "Do you want to know my name?" "Yes." "You want to know my name?" "Yes. You have come to visit me in my tent, and I would like to know who you are." "All right, I am Kuhl. What is your name?" "My name is Pritchard." "What is your father's name?" "My father's name is also Pritchard." "No, that cannot be true. You cannot have the same name as your father." "It is the name of my lineage. What is the name of your lineage?" "Do you want to know the name of my lineage?" "Yes." "What will you do with it if I tell you? Will you take it to your country?" I don't want to do anything with it. I just want to know what it is since I'm living at your camp. Oh, well, we are Lu. I did not ask you the name of your tribe. I know that. I'm asking you the name of your lineage. Why do you want to know the name of my lineage? I don't want to know it. Then why do you ask me for it? Give me some tobacco. So even the great Evans Pritchard, right, one of the sort of early sort of famous anthropologists, had some of the same challenges that all of us do when we try to sit down with someone for what may feel like a kind of straightforward exchange of information. So all the questions about both who you are vis-a-vis the person you're interviewing, right? Do they know you or not? Who do they sort of think you are, or what do they think about your social position? What do they understand about, again, why you're asking these questions? Contextualizing it for people by explaining who you are and what you're doing in the beginning is something that anthropologists always do. But that doesn't necessarily stop there being some moments of sort of confusion, right? Or digression or derailment. So part of what I want to say here is don't worry if the interview, as you imagine it in your mind or as you set it up on paper, like these are the questions I'm asking in this order. I've put all this energy into like exactly how I word my questions. And then you get in there and it kind of turns into a free-for-all, or people say stuff you didn't expect, or it goes in that direction or in that direction. All that's fine. Okay. You do want to strive for learning certain things from your interviews, but it's also an open-ended process. You are engaging with another human being, right? This is not a cut and dried phenomenon, right? The other human being that you're engaging with, it's up to them how they answer, whether they stick with your questions or ask different questions or respond to different questions. So understand it as that. And also, I think, remember that almost regardless of what happens in an interview, you learn something. So even if it feels like, boy, that did not go well, you learn something. If people, don't want to talk about a certain subject, which is absolutely their right, you learn something about the complexity of asking people about certain kinds of subjects, right? If somebody, on the other hand, talks for 20 minutes when you ask them something, right, and connects what you asked to all kinds of other things that you never thought of as being connected, then you definitely learn something, right? So rolling with sort of what happens in the interview, I think, is a super important part of it. And it actually is also what makes it exciting and interesting and sort of a place of discovery. You don't know what's going to happen or what's going to come out of an interview. And that's, I think, part of what's fun about it, right? Or what's exciting and interesting about it. So don't try to tamp down the sort of uncontrollable aspects of interviewing. Okay, so let me talk a little bit more nitty-gritty about different sort of mechanical things to think about in doing interviews, and then we'll relate it kind of directly to what you're going to do in the paper. So the first distinction I want to make is between two kinds of interview. And again, these are kind of broad strokes, but it should be useful for you to understand what you're going to do. So structured versus unstructured interviews. What you're going to be doing are unstructured interviews. Now, the difference is this. A structured interview is structured in the sense of having a clear sequence, having established questions, and being conducted in as consistent a way as possible from one interviewee to the next. Okay. On the other hand, an unstructured interview is one that starts in sort of the same way, in the sense that you have your questions, you've thought hard about which order to put them in, and you've thought about exactly what language to use to ask them. But in the unstructured interview, you are free to essentially follow the conversation where it may lead, even if it leads you off script. So in an unstructured interview, if you ask a question and the answer is something maybe surprising, right, you can then follow up and say, tell me more about that. And then you can formulate another question, right? You can take that little side trip and then come back to your script, right, after that. So the way I think of it is in the unstructured interview, you are going to give some of the control of the conversation or more control of the conversation to the interviewee. You're going to cede total control, right? So if it's still on you to decide which things to follow up on, right? And I'm not saying, like, if somebody talks for 3 hours about something completely unrelated to what you want to know, that it's not okay to say, let me ask you, like, can we, get back to the subject? That's fine, right? But it's listening in the moment to what someone's telling you and following up on the parts of their answer that seem valuable or relevant or whatever, okay? So the structured interview, where you stick to the script and you try to make your interviews consistent from one to the next, is useful in a context where you're really trying to get a sense of an overall pattern across a large number of people. If you want something to be comparative, like what, I'm going to interview 100 people, what percentage of that 100 thought this or mentioned this, right? To make that kind of more pattern assessment, you need to have some consistency across those interviews, right? The unstructured interviews will not necessarily be the same from one to the next. Even if you start with the same questions and you interview 100 people, if you let the conversation go where it needs to go, each one is going to be a little unique. It doesn't mean you can't find patterns there, but it's just a little bit different. You're going to have to use more interpretation of what is important in those interviews than you do with a structured interview, okay? So for this assignment, for this class, I want you to use unstructured interviews, okay? Now, that's 2 categories of interview. Within an interview, obviously, you're going to ask questions that you need to compose. What I have here in terms of kinds of interview questions, again, not exhaustive. There's many other kinds of questions than this. But I wanted to give you a few examples of varieties of questions that I think could be useful. Also just to spark your imagination about different ways to ask people stuff, right? So I'm not saying you have to, you have to have one grand tour question. You have to have one example question. It's not like that. But think about the different sorts of questions you can ask and try to choose which kind of question might be best suited to what you're trying to find out, okay? So here are 4 examples of kinds of interview questions. So a grand tour question is, as the name implies, asking somebody to give you a general overview on a topic, right? So the idea of grand tour is saying to somebody something like, walk me through a day in your life, or walk me through what you do in a day on the job, right? So you're going to take them on a sort of narrated tour, right? So you're asking them for the big picture, okay? Which can be useful, particularly early on in an interview. The second is a much more specific kind of question where you can ask somebody an example question. An example question can be a standalone question, or it can also be a follow-up question. So if in the grand tour, right, you learn that, in this kind of work, usually the day-to-day is the same, except for, on Fridays, we have, a special event. You might say, oh, can you give me an example of what that special event is like, right? So it could be like zooming in on a piece of the overall answer, or making somebody or asking somebody to give you like the nuts and bolts, like a specific example of something that they answered in the abstract, right? So if they say, we get along really well in the office, you might say, oh, can you give me an example of like something that's happened that showed you how well people get along, right? These are not great examples, but you understand what I'm getting at, I'm sure. The example question also can be standalone. So you could say, give me an example of whatever it is, right? So part of, I think, the value of an example question is sort of bringing people down to earth. So not having all the answers be, again, sort of abstract or general, but grounding it in one occasion about which hopefully they can give you more detail that'll help you understand better, right? An experience question is not dissimilar from that. This is asking people for their direct experiences, right? So asking people to report on something specific that they did, right? So not asking somebody, for example, what do you think a healthy breakfast is, right? Or they might say, well, it's supposed to have, the fruits and whatever. You could say, what did you have for breakfast today, right? So you're asking people to give you basically specific kind of data, if you will, or information that in it, one example of that may not tell you all that much. But if you interview 100 people and you ask them all, what did you have for breakfast today? You might start to see something in a pattern, right? So again, example questions, experience questions are a little bit more specific. The final example I'll give you is what I'm calling a native language question. And this doesn't necessarily mean asking somebody about a language other than your spoken language, right? It is absolutely the case that cultural anthropologists will often be doing interviews in a second language, right? Depending on what the field site is. So it could be that, like, because you're asking people questions in something that is your second language, you're asking them to help you understand a term you don't know very well. But it can also be if you're both speaking your native language, right? If you are, interviewing another English speaker in English, right, in Chicago, it can be asking them to break down something that is a specific word or phrase used in a subculture, used in their work, right? Something else that seems to, either you're not familiar with or seems to you to carry meaning, right? It seems important, that concept or that word, right? So if you hear people employing a word or a phrase in a way that feels enticing or important or interesting, then asking people, tell me what, you keep using this word, you keep using this phrase, or whenever you talk about this phenomenon, you use this adjective. Can you tell me more what that means or what you mean by that? So asking people to sort of break down for you some of the terms or words that they use can also be an interesting way to get at some of that more detailed understanding of a particular social practice or social world. Okay. So, sort of the final thing in terms of a general overview of interviewing is, of course, when you're doing interviews as a cultural anthropologist or for a cultural anthropology class, you don't only need to think about what am I going to ask to, engage people in an interesting conversation, but you're also going to want to think about how am I going to capture that information, because I'm, as if you're a cultural anthropologist, like doing a field study, how am I going to capture that? Because I'm going to need to collect information from 100 interviews. And if I don't capture it in some way, I'm not going to remember, right? If I'm going to write a book about it later, I need to have some way to nail down what happened in that conversation. Likewise, for this class, where you're going to be writing a paper, you need to be able to capture the information in the moment, okay? So you have a few options. One is to write or type notes at the time of the interview, right? So while you're talking to the person, you are jotting down a few notes in your notebook or typing something into a Word doc, whatever it is. Of course, the challenge of that is keeping the conversation going, listening, and trying to record, like write things down at the same time. You all do that all the time when you listen to a lecture and take notes on it. Part of you is still listening to what's happening in the lecture, even while you're writing down or taking notes on what was just said, right? So that's one possibility. The second is to write or type up your notes immediately after an interview. This sometimes feels scary to people because I think folks worry that, like, as soon as if the person's not in front of you, you're not going to remember anything. If you sit down literally immediately after the conversation, you will remember more than you might think. But it does require doing it right away, right? If you wait an hour, if you wait a day, you'll remember less and less, okay? The third way, which is probably the most obvious way, right, is to use some kind of digital recorder. You can use your phone, you can use some other kind of device, right? And that, of course, gives you like a really complete record of what happened. You get the language, right? What you asked, what the other person said exactly. You also get things like tone of voice, right? So, of course, that's a really great method. My suggestion is that you use any two of these. Even if you're doing a digital recording, tape recorders mess up. Sometimes there's background noise, whatever it is. Take notes as well. The other reason to take notes is if you do a digital recording of an interview, it's great, but it also can be kind of labor intensive to get the main points out of that, right? Like if you do an interview that's an hour long, if you don't take any notes, the only way to get back to that content is to re-listen for an hour. If in addition to capturing the entire thing in a recording, you also have jotted down a few notes, you already sort of have the beginnings of a written document that leads you to most important things, right? So pick any two and you should be great. All right, so all of this is background for the interview assignment that you all will be doing, which is due on October 20th. So what I want to do now is go to the handout for that assignment, which is in D2L, and we'll talk through the specifics of the assignment. Okay, so here we are in D2L, and I'm going to go to assignments. And this is the interview assignment due October 20th. I'm in instructor view, so I'm going to have to get at the handout a little bit differently than you will when you go in, but you should see the attached handout right away. Here it is. Let's look at it. Okay. So, here we are. Hold on. Let's do it this way. It's easier to see. Okay. So, actually, let me make it a little bigger. All right. So, this is the handout for this assignment. And what you'll see in here is that what you're being asked to do is to conduct 3 interviews on a subject of your choosing related to gender, sexuality, and the body, and then to write up a 5 to 6 page essay that discusses what you learned from those interviews and also reflecting on interviewing as a research method, okay? So, what I've done in terms of the first step, which is choosing a subject, right? What I've done is just give you a list of themes that I think that are related to the class, many of which, or almost all of which, many of which we talk about in the class, and that are also fairly general in the sense that you can go in multiple directions within any one of these topics. And then, of course, I've also given you the other category. If you don't like any of these and you want to, if you have another topic in mind, again, in the general realm of gender, sexuality, and the body is the only thing I really ask, that's fine. You can just email me and say, hey, I want to do it on whatever, and we can talk about that, okay? So I don't want to limit what you do, but I thought it might be a good start to give you a list just to spark some ideas, okay? So again, these are a range of all kinds of subjects. None of them is very specific. You can take any of them in any direction, but I do want you to identify a topic, right? Like, I don't want you to just be doing interviews on gender, right? It's too broad. It's hard to have a meaningful conversation on something that's so broad. So pick something a little bit more specific that will help you, again, sort of define your topic, and it'll help you write your questions and do the interviews, I think. Okay, so you choose your subject, and then you're going to do 3 interviews with anybody, all right? It can be people you know, it can be people you don't know or that you approach just for this. It can be people in your family, your friends, that's fine too. There are different kinds of challenges of doing an interview with somebody you know really well versus doing an interview with somebody you don't know. But they're both fine, right? So again, think about it. Think about who you know or would like to reach out to set up an interview. You're going to find 3 people and you're going to interview them. As I say here on the handout, I want you to do unstructured interviews, right? So as I say, I want you to start by writing questions. I suggest you write 8 to 10 questions, and you're going to take those into the interview. You're going to start from those. And it may very well be in some or all of your interviews that it just kind of goes down the line. The person gives you a brief answer and that's it, and that's fine. Again, the idea with unstructured interviewing is if somebody says something that sparks a follow-up question from you, or takes you down a whole sort of sequence of questions, that's fine, right? So part of what that means is you need to think on your feet a bit in doing an unstructured interview. You need to listen carefully to what the person's telling you, and you need to make some decisions in the moment about how you will, again, sort of follow up on what you've heard, right? So, it is a little bit of it's not exactly improvisational, but there is a little bit of that feeling of needing to think and make a quick decision about what am I going to do next, right? So that's the approach. And as I say, it can be anyone. Yes, and lecture 3, which is what we're making right now, is where you're going to get these details. Okay. In terms of the sort of being clear with people about what you're doing, if you were, professional cultural anthropologist doing a a research study and you were going to try to publish a book out of it, there would be a quite rigorous informed consent process, right? Cultural anthropologists, like all researchers, take very seriously that we conduct our research in an ethical way. And one part of those research ethics is the importance of always making sure you have informed consent from anyone who would participate in your work, right? So interviewees are definitely an example of that. Because this is a student activity, and we're not going to try to publish these, and no one is going to see your paper except for me and maybe, a couple of colleagues or whatever, you don't need to go through a formal informed consent process, okay? But regardless of that, ethical research is mainly about being clear about your intentions and about the implications, if any, for the person participating. So I still want you to do that part of it, right? I want you to sort of informally engage in informed consent. So what that means is simply that you are, upfront with people, that you say, I'm a student, I'm taking this anthro class, we're working on interviewing, we're working on subjects related to gender and sexuality, and I would love to talk to you about this. And what I'm going to do with this interview is use the information to write a paper that my professor is going to read, right? You should give folks the option of remaining anonymous in the sense of you can use a pseudonym for them. You can make a point of obscuring any details. Part of what anthropologists always work at is making sure that anybody who participates, like by giving interviews, for example, or being observed in some way, that no one could identify that person in particular through the details you include in the writing, right? So it's a common technique for anthropologists to not exactly say what town they worked in. Like they have to talk about which region they're in for it to make sense, but they often will say it's in this general area of the country, but not say exactly where. Make up a name for a town, make up pseudonyms for the people responding, and obscure any details that would lead somebody reading it to go, oh, I know who that guy is, right? So those basic protections for the people that you interview, I think is an important just general practice, even if this is not a formal study, all right? So you always want to tell folks when you sit down with them, this is voluntary. If you at any time want to stop, if there's any questions you don't want to answer, that is, of course, you are right. We will stop immediately, right? So you make it clear to the interviewee that you are giving them control in that sense, right? You don't ever want anybody to feel unsafe or like they're being pushed to answer something that they may feel uncomfortable with, right? Establishing enough rapport that you can have sort of a nice back and forth with someone, of course, is great and should be done. And there may be moments when an interviewee goes, you know what, this is just not something I feel like talking about right now. Absolutely, we want to respect that 100%. And this is also where nothing that happens in an interview is a waste of time. If somebody says, this is making me really uncomfortable, this question, or this brings up too many difficult memories for me, right? And you have to end the interview. That is useful information for learning about how to do interviews and how to engage with people, right? Sometimes, especially, this is a class about gender, sexuality, and the body. There are a lot of topics within this area that are sensitive to talk to people about. So we do want to talk to people about them because it's important. And we want to make sure we're completely, as much as we can, be completely respectful of any boundaries they draw, okay? So I'm not trying to scare you about the process, but just to say, use your understanding of how it is to engage with other people, right, as well. You don't need a guidebook per se to be able to tell when it's okay to keep going or whether it's important to stop. So use your sense as a social being to figure out what is best in the moment in these settings, all right? And let your interviewee know that they call the shots, okay? So I think then you should have a little kind of preamble, either at the time you invite the person and or right as you start the interview, right? Where you say, here's who I am, here's why want to ask you these questions, here's the context, right? A class, etc. And I'm really grateful for you being willing to talk to me. And please, if at any moment you want to discontinue this, please know that that is 100% your decision, okay? I think that is sufficient. You don't need them to sign a form. If you did a formal study, that's what we have to do, right? We have to, not have to, but that is the sort of standard practice, is to have the interviewee actually sign an informed consent form. I'm not asking you to do that, but I'm asking you to do something in the spirit of that for your own interviews. Okay. I've already talked about your options for recording, right? Again, I suggest using a couple of those. And then the rest of the handout gets into what you're actually going to write up, all right? So I want, first, a detailed description of the content of your 3 interviews. I'm not asking you for a transcript, right? So I don't want something where you transcribe what was on the recording and that's what you present. I want you to process it at least a little bit. I want you to summarize it, but keep a lot of detail in, including things like direct quotes, right? I don't want you to completely generalize it, but I want you to summarize it so you present to me what the most important kinds of things were that came out, okay? So that's the first part, a detailed description. And then the second part is an analysis. And I give you some specific things to think about, right? Like, and a lot of this is going to have to be partly your interpretation, your assessment of what you learned, right? What are the most significant in your opinion, right? And based on what you learned, right? What are the most significant issues that came up? Particularly things that come up across the 3 interviews. If you start to see a pattern, that's a thing that should jump out at you and you want to talk about, right? And then for each theme or issue, I want you to ground it in the specific things you heard in your interviews. So if you say, hey, I'm seeing this sort of pattern or theme across my 3 interviews, and it's this, and then you might say, for example, interviewee 1 says blank, 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 like a little direct quote. Interviewee 2 said this, interviewee 3 said that, right? Like they all said kind of similar things, or they all seem to speak to a certain theme, okay? So you want to make like an overarching point, right? Like a point that encapsulates multiple things that you learned. And you want to provide the evidence for your assessment that that's an important issue. And the evidence is evidence from the details of the interviews, okay? And then the final part of the paper is I want you to reflect on the actual experience of doing interviews, right? Like part of the idea here is to think about the research methods that anthropologists use. So the sort of prompt for this part is, what do you think are the strengths and limitations of conducting interviews regarding gender, sexuality, and the body? So there's already kind of a few things bundled in there, and I'm going to leave it open to you to how you answer this. Part of it is what are the strengths and limitations in general of doing interviews, and part of it is are there any things that are particularly we need to think about in terms of strengths and limitations when we're interviewing on these topics, okay? So those are your prompts. And then, the rest of the handout is, little formatting stuff that's pretty straightforward. And then I do give you the rubric so you know how I'm going to go about assessing it, all right? So, I suggest that you read the handout initially, right, as you're sort of starting the project. And then also, like when you have a draft and you're sort of going back to revise and edit and whatever, make sure you take a look again at the handout to make sure that you sort of completed all the different things that are on here. And the rubric will come in handy then because it says sort of exactly, which kinds of things are important and what you need to be striving for. Okay. So I think that is a good, hopefully, overview of both methods in cultural anthropology, specifically interviewing, and how you're going to apply that understanding, that knowledge, that technique to this particular assignment. Again, due October 20th. If you have any questions, once you start working on it, etc., please don't hesitate to get in touch, and I will talk to you soon. Bye-bye.